Thebes, 1250 BCE. Dawn creeps across the limestone ramparts, painting the city in muted golds and shadowed greys. The air is heavy with incense, curling in precise spirals from the temple of Amun-Ra, and the corridors echo faintly with the footfalls of priests in linen kilts. Somewhere beyond the central hall, a bell chimes, a deep, resonant tone that cuts through the murmurs of devotion. In a hidden chamber beneath the palace, the boy prince sleeps, unaware of the currents of intrigue swirling above him. His cradle rocks lightly, disturbed by the soft vibration of ritual drums, and the scent of perfumed oils clings to the stone walls, a reminder of the sacred and the profane entwined in one breath. The walls themselves seem to lean inward, absorbing whispers, plotting secrets. The boy's father, Pharaoh Merenta, too, sits in private consultation with his chief vizier, fingers drumming on polished ebony. Their conversation is muted, yet the tension between the two men is visible in the rigid set of their shoulders, in the measured way they avert one another's gaze. Outside, the city hums with life, merchants calling their wares, children scuttling through alleys, temple priests guiding the faithful toward the scent of sacrifice. But inside the palace, the heartbeat is different, slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of dynastic imperatives that have dictated the rise and fall of generations. Here, in the spaces carved from sandstone, decisions are made not by public acclaim, but by subtle coercion, ritual, and the quiet assertion of authority. Before we continue, if you love uncovering the buried truths of history, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I find it fascinating that across time and distance, our curiosity connects us through these forgotten stories. This is not merely the story of a king or an heir, but of the pressures, the rituals, and the silent machinery of power that shaped their fates. Merenta II's reign was one of consolidation, an era in which the boundaries between devotion and domination blurred. Historical records imply, though never confirm, that he maintained an inner circle of priests who functioned less as spiritual guides and more as instruments of governance, their influence insidious yet absolute. Their authority was woven into the daily life of the palace, from the measured rhythm of meals to the cadence of ceremonial marches through colonnades that caught the light in ways meant to awe, intimidate, and control. The young heir, scarcely 9 years old, walked these halls under the watchful eyes of tutors, guards, and priests who measured every gesture, every breath. Childhood in such a crucible was neither innocent nor forgiving. Education was rigorous. The hieroglyphs of law, the poetry of liturgy, and the tactical lessons of statecraft were drilled into him with a relentless rhythm, punctuated by threats of humiliation and ritualized chastisement. He learned quickly that obedience was survival and silence an ally. Behind every smile or tilt of the head, he discerned the invisible hands that shaped his destiny, the invisible eyes that judged each fleeting emotion. The architecture itself served as an instrument of psychological control. Narrow corridors funneled movement, chambers echoed selectively, and the alignment of doorways dictated who could see who manned when. Light was a manipulator, shadows a companion. Even the sounds of the palace were orchestrated. The tap of sandals across polished floors, the rustle of linen, the distant hum of temple chanting. Each sensory element was curated to reinforce hierarchy, to whisper the consequences of failure, and to illuminate, ever so subtly, the precariousness of birthright. By the time he was 10, the boy prince had begun to understand that his life was a vessel for the performance of power. Every gesture, every syllable, was both a lesson and a test. The priests who monitored his education imparted knowledge with the same precision they employed in rituals meticulous, exacting, yet wrapped in layers of devotion that masked the undertone of coercion. Records suggest that such rituals involved symbolic acts designed to bind the prince to the state, to render him both heir and instrument. Whether these acts were protective or punitive is a matter of debate, yet their psychological weight is undeniable. Night fell like a silken curtain, and the corridors darkened. Torches flickered against sandstone, casting exaggerated shadows that danced across carvings of gods and pharaohs alike. Somewhere beyond the private apartments, the priests convened, their voices low, rehearsed, almost musical in their cadence. Plans were whispered, decisions finalized, all under the guise of sacred duty. In the silence of the boy's chamber, a single thought might have crossed his mind, that the very hands meant to guide him could just as easily strike. And in that understanding, the first seeds of fear and obedience were sown. As the city outside succumbed to the quiet of night, the palace breathed differently. It was not merely a residence, but a living organism, its stone walls absorbing ambition, envy, and devotion. The boy's cradle creaked once more. Somewhere, unseen, destiny was already in motion. And the ritual of power, older than memory, older than any king recorded, continued unabated, waiting for its moment to demand both loyalty and sacrifice. The stage was set, and as the first flicker of dawn approached, the corridors whispered promises of transformation, of ascension, of deeds that would be whispered across millennia. From this moment, the story of the lost king and the heir he would betray was no longer simply one of birthright. It had become an intricate study in the anatomy of power. The boy stirred, and above him, in the heart of the palace, men whispered a plan that would forever alter the line of succession. The boy awoke to the quiet scent of incense and the distant murmur of temple priests, their voices echoing down corridors carved from ochre sandstone. Each morning, he rose to a cadence he did not choose, a rhythm dictated by the palace, by tradition, by the silent orchestration of power. By the age of 12, the child who had once stumbled through hallways now moved with deliberate grace, every step rehearsed, every gesture measured. Tutelage had transformed into indoctrination. His instructors, high priests, versed in both theology and subtle coercion, imposed exercises that blended instruction with ritualized obedience. They guided him through the delicate balance of devotion and performance, ensuring that his youth was not wasted on innocence, but forged into a tool of authority. Daily rituals began before sunrise. The prince knelt upon cold stone, hands folded, eyes tracing the gilded hieroglyphs that chronicled gods and kings alike. The priest's chants washed over him, a tide of sound meant to drown the boy's uncertainty and replace it with reverent precision. Historians still debate whether these early rites were protective, intended to mold him for leadership, or punitive, a means of curbing the fragile psyche of the heir. In practice, they were both a seamless blend of discipline and devotion, leaving no margin for thought outside the prescribed order. Every misstep, every hesitation was noted, and the weight of scrutiny pressed upon him like the cool stone beneath his knees. By the age of 14, alliances were being cultivated. Courtiers whispered, siblings observed, and the palace itself had become a crucible in which every interaction carried significance. The young prince learned to navigate these networks as adeptly as he memorized sacred texts. The priest's influence was pervasive. They guided his understanding of loyalty and fear, subtly intertwining both with theology. Their control was not merely administrative, but psychological, a constant shaping of thought and perception. Records suggest that these alliances and subtle manipulations were formalized through ceremonial gatherings, where loyalty was observed in posture, in gaze, in silence. Each gathering was a theater of obedience, a subtle audition for trust, and a rehearsal for the eventual display of authority. His training extended beyond the sacred chambers into the architecture itself. Passageways became classrooms. Corridors were corridors of learning. The spatial design of the palace, once mere residence, became an instrument of education. Narrow corridors enforced focus. Vaulted ceilings echoed obedience. Shadowed alcoves taught vigilance. Light, ever precise, traced lines across mosaics of deities and pharaohs, instructing the boy on the significance of hierarchy. In these subtle orchestrations, the prince absorbed the unspoken rules of power: who could approach, who was denied, when silence served as armor, and when compliance was survival. In every glimmer and shadow, he learned to interpret the palace itself as a teacher, one more exacting than any human mentor. At 15, the boy was no longer a child, but a figure in preparation for dominion. Rituals grew more elaborate, designed to test endurance, loyalty, and the subtle acquisition of fear and awe. Priests guided him through rites involving ceremonial purification, recitation of dynastic lore, and the observation of sacrifices meant to cement his role as heir. Some records imply these rites bordered on cruel, a psychological forging rather than physical harm. The boy learned that the body, the breath, the very posture of a king were instruments of influence. He discovered the duality of power. It was at once protective, drawing divine favor, and perilous, threatening ruin should he falter. By 16, he had begun to wield influence over minor courts, his voice measured, his judgments precise. The priests, now more advisors than instructors, orchestrated subtle tests, alliances to be navigated, minor decrees to be executed, ceremonial knowledge to be demonstrated. Each test reinforced the principle that the boy was both heir and instrument, that his rise depended as much on compliance with ritual as on innate cunning. Observers of the era, in fragments of surviving correspondence, note the boy's demeanor, confident yet wary, regal yet restrained, a product of both bloodline and indoctrination. The palace itself had become a labyrinth of control, and the prince its most attentive inhabitant. Every corridor, every chamber, every shadow whispered lessons in governance and obedience. The priest's presence, invisible yet omnipresent, shaped not only action but thought. He learned that power was a performance, history a manipulated canvas, and faith a tool wielded by those who controlled both ritual and narrative. Within these walls, the boy grew into a figure capable of extraordinary calculation, one whose understanding of hierarchy and control would soon become inexorably entwined with the fate of his own lineage. As the sun traced its arc over Thebes, gilding columns in fleeting brilliance, the prince approached his 15th year's culmination, a ceremony of symbolic ascension, a test of authority under the watchful eyes of priests and courtiers alike. Here, he would first demonstrate the precision of ritual and the weight of judgment that came with proximity to ultimate power. It was in this crucible of light and stone that the child would begin the transformation into a king capable of unspeakable decisions. And so, beneath vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of devotion, in corridors echoing with ritualized breath, the stage was set for the boy to step fully into his destiny. The line between heir and instrument had blurred, and the silent currents of palace intrigue had begun to converge, drawing him inexorably toward acts that would define both his reign and his legacy. The boy knelt once more, palms pressed to cool sandstone, and in the faint flicker of torchlight, the first murmurs of betrayal, manipulation, and ruthless ambition began to take shape. By 17, the prince had become inseparable from the machinery of the palace, his presence a living node within a network of surveillance, ritual, and obedience. The priests who had guided him now observed him as a peer might a fragile instrument, noting subtle shifts in posture, tone, and expression. Their control, though invisible, was absolute. Even a gesture as small as a hand resting lightly on a threshold could be interpreted as compliance or dissent. Records suggest that during this period, the boy's education expanded into the governance of temples, taxation, and minor judicial decrees. Each instruction was layered with ritual significance, ensuring that power was never exercised without acknowledgement of divine and sacerdotal authority. In these corridors of stone and shadow, he learned that dominion was as much a matter of perception as it was of decree. The consolidation of influence was inseparable from psychological mastery. Priestly counsel blended theology with manipulation, teaching that obedience was both sacred duty and survival strategy. They guided the young ruler through subtle exercises, discerning who deferred under pressure, which courtiers trembled in whispered assemblies, whose loyalty could be counted upon. Every encounter, every gathering, was a rehearsal in strategy. The prince observed carefully, understanding that even casual conversation could be weaponized, and silence itself was an instrument of negotiation. The palace became a laboratory of power, each interaction a specimen, each ceremony a demonstration of hierarchical precision. By 18, he had assumed responsibilities that blurred the line between heir and sovereign. Minor edicts bore his signature, ceremonial proclamations required his presence, and rituals once designed as instruction now served as displays of authority. The priests, their roles now advisory yet no less controlling, ensured that each act reinforced a central truth. Power is performance, perception its most reliable vehicle. Within the palace, observers recorded awe, fear, and devotion, all meticulously curated by the prince's actions. Historians still debate the extent to which these rituals shaped the young king's psyche, but fragments of correspondence imply that the conflation of sacred authority and coercion left little room for dissent or personal morality. The young ruler's relationships were equally instruments of control. Courtiers, tutors, and minor princes navigated a complex lattice of favor and fear. Their actions constrained by observation, ritual, and the invisible gaze of priestly intermediaries. Alliances were never merely political. They were psychological, demanding constant calculation, careful restraint, and an understanding that one misstep could trigger repercussions extending far beyond the immediate chamber. Even familial interactions were framed within this architecture of power. A nod of approval, a touch on the shoulder, or the omission of intimacy could signal compliance or contempt. Within these constraints, the prince honed a capacity for detachment, learning that survival required the careful suppression of personal attachment in favor of calculated engagement. Physical ritual became both tool and lesson. Initiation rites, once aimed at cementing obedience, now demonstrated authority, transforming him into the embodiment of the state's sacred and secular powers. Historical records indicate that these rites involved purification, ceremonial dressing in linen and gold, and symbolic acts connecting the ruler to deities and ancestors alike. Each movement was prescribed, each breath measured. Yet within these strictures, the prince discovered the subtle art of influence, the ability to inspire devotion through the display of reverence, to project power through the choreography of compliance. In essence, he became both subject and sovereign, simultaneously molded by ritual and capable of commanding it. By 19, he had begun to exert influence beyond palace walls. Minor provinces, overseen by governors appointed by priestly recommendation, fell under his scrutiny. Correspondence suggests he observed taxation, ceremonial compliance, and military readiness with a meticulous eye. He recognized that true authority required both demonstration and manipulation. Public acts of piety reinforced legitimacy, while private calculations ensured that loyalty remained contingent and controlled. The priests, ever watchful, guided him subtly, maintaining a web of obligation, superstition, and reverence that reinforced their influence while elevating his own capacity for command. The psychological architecture of the palace had achieved a remarkable symmetry. Stone corridors, patterned light, ritualized movement, and human observation combined to enforce hierarchy at every level. The young king's consciousness absorbed these lessons with precision. He understood that the most potent control was invisible, that fear could be as effective as love, that faith, when intertwined with obligation, could bend wills with little apparent effort. Within this lattice of light and shadow, the boy prince, now approaching manhood, transformed into a sovereign whose knowledge of both human nature and sacred authority would soon dictate the fate of his own line. Yet the ultimate test remained: the manipulation of kin, the assertion of absolute power within his family, and the confrontation with the ultimate paradox of rulership, that those closest to him could be both instruments and threats. As torches flickered across the walls of the palace, casting long shadows of gods and kings alike, the stage was being prepared for a decision that would intertwine destiny, blood, and betrayal. Every corridor seemed to murmur, every column to bend in expectation. And in that confluence of architecture, ritual, and observation, the prince understood that, to ascend fully, he would have to command not just obedience, but the surrender of trust itself. And so, as dawn approached again over Thebes, the young sovereign prepared to test the full extent of his authority. What had begun as instruction and survival was now the deliberate orchestration of power, culminating in acts that would forever alter both palace and lineage. The boy prince was no longer a child. He had become the instrument of ritual, and soon, the arbiter of lives most sacred to him. The day of reckoning arrived like a slow, deliberate shadow across the palace. Torches flickered along limestone corridors, casting elongated, trembling silhouettes of deities and kings, as though the walls themselves anticipated the unfolding of irrevocable deeds. The young sovereign, now fully tempered by ritual, observation, and instruction, moved with quiet certainty. His eyes traced familiar angles, the carved reliefs of gods who demanded obedience, the narrow corridors where whispers of loyalty and treachery alike had passed unnoticed, the chambers where history had been both recorded and concealed. Each step was deliberate, measured, a choreography honed over years of training. And in the hush between breath and motion, he understood that power demanded a cost that sometimes bore the shape of family. The heir, barely 16, unaware of the intricate lattice of manipulation surrounding him, prepared for a minor ceremonial offering in the inner sanctum. He followed instructions learned since early childhood, repeating prayers and gestures as if repetition alone could guarantee safety. But the boy's every action was scrutinized by the sovereign and the priests alike. Historical fragments suggest that these moments were designed not merely to instruct, but to test endurance, loyalty, and compliance. Within the sanctuary, the air was dense with incense and anticipation. The scent of myrrh mingled with the faint coppery hint of blood, anticipated yet unspilled, a subtle prelude to the transgression that would solidify a reign. Records, though sparse and contradictory, imply the sovereign approached the chamber with measured intent. The priests, advisors, and instruments of ritual authority stood nearby, their presence both silent witness and implicit accomplice. The boy prince, now king in all but name, understood that the ultimate assertion of power required a decisive act, the elimination of a potential rival, even if that rival bore his own blood. Scholars debate whether the act was premeditated from the outset of his rise, or if it emerged as the culmination of years of manipulation and observation. What is clear is that the convergence of ritual, psychology, and architecture provided the perfect stage. Within the sanctum, light fell in deliberate angles through latticework, illuminating the young heir's hesitant movements. Stone surfaces absorbed every footfall, every whisper, amplifying the gravity of the moment. The sovereign's hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder, gesture both intimate and lethal, before drawing back to command obedience in silence. The act itself was swift, executed with precision, born of years of discipline and strategic insight. The corridor outside remained empty, save for shadows that seemed to bend in recognition of the irrevocable. Outside, the city continued, unaware of the seismic shift within its palace. Its pulse uninterrupted even as dynastic continuity was severed. The aftermath was immediate and carefully orchestrated. Priestly decrees reframed the event as divine will, ritual as necessity, and obedience as survival. Courtiers were instructed to observe silence, and whispers of betrayal were carefully contained. In these moments, the sovereign fully realized the duality of power, absolute in execution, yet fragile in perception. The architectural, ritualistic, and psychological lessons instilled over nearly a decade coalesced into this act, demonstrating that dominion required both courage and ruthlessness, devotion and detachment. The palace itself, its walls imbued with memory and expectation, absorbed the event with quiet complicity. Historians still debate the moral calculus of this act. Records imply, though never confirm, that the young king experienced neither immediate remorse nor unbridled joy, but a meticulous awareness of consequence, legacy, and perception. He had become the instrument of ritual, the arbiter of life and death, and the embodiment of a system that demanded both loyalty and sacrifice. In doing so, he redefined the meaning of succession, transforming the palace from a place of instruction and observation into a theater of absolute power. As dusk fell, corridors grew colder, shadows stretched longer, and the flicker of torches cast grotesque reflections on stone walls. The sovereign walked alone, tracing paths familiar yet forever altered by the event he had enacted. The architecture, light, and ritual had been both teachers and witnesses. Now they bore silent testimony to an act that would reverberate through generations. He understood, finally, that history itself was malleable, recorded by those who survived, remembered by those who conformed, and interpreted through the prism of power. The palace, steeped in the smell of incense and the lingering echo of chants, returned to its rhythm. Life continued in corridors and courtyards, but within the stone chambers, the boy who had become king paused, contemplating the paradox of his ascension, that to preserve the dynasty, he had obliterated its future in one decisive act. Light fractured across gilded surfaces, shadows lengthened, and the air carried a solemn weight, a reflection of both triumph and loss. Within this silence, the sovereign absorbed the magnitude of what had been done. And in the final quiet of the evening, as the first stars appeared over Thebes, he He understood the truth his training had taught him, that power is performance, history is manipulation, and faith can be wielded as both shield and weapon. Within the cold embrace of stone corridors, among the echoes of ritual and devotion, he felt the pulse of legacy, absolute and unyielding. She didn't just wear ritual, she became the silence it demanded. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness intrigued you, another secret awaits. Click the next story appearing on your screen to continue our journey through time. And remember to subscribe because the past still whispers if you know how to listen.